Brian, and many, many thanks to the Zeidler Memorial Lecture Committee. I especially want to thank Tom Heinen, Anita Zeidler, and Phil Blank for their exceptional efforts in putting this event together. I know it took a lot of time. And I wanted to give a special thanks to the Milwaukee Public Library for hosting this event and for being there for all those years that I spent researching this book. I spent many wonderful hours here and got to see firsthand the dedication and the absolute integrity of the public employee staff that works at the Milwaukee Public Library. They embody the public service that Frank Zeidler cared about so deeply. And I want to give a special shout out to MPTV. My book includes an entire chapter on the origins of public television in Milwaukee in the 1950s. It was a hotly contested topic, with liberals seeing the new medium as having great potential for educating and enlightening the public, while some conservatives saw it as part of the spread of socialism and communism and waged a strong campaign to prevent its creation. I'm deeply honored to give the 2016 Frank Zeidler Memorial Lecture. I was privileged to know Frank. I met him while I was a student at Marquette University, and like so many people, recognized his integrity, his intellect, and his humanity. Especially in the current environment, Frank's lifetime commitment to working for world peace, excellence in public service, and the greater collective good stand as a beacon for what each of us and for what our society could become, if only we dare reach for the stars that he gazed at so often. Frank, this talk is for you. William Grady, a prosperous industrialist in 1950s Milwaukee, looked around at what was going on in the country, and he did not like what he saw. Grady was outraged because workers by the tens of thousands had launched strikes at factories, demanding salary increases after the long wartime wage freeze, but also insisting that they help make decisions affecting their workplaces. Grady was livid that Congress in 1949 had passed the Housing Act, opening the way for federal dollars to flow to cities that enacted laws to create affordable housing. Grady believed government was also getting involved in other areas that it had no business in, issuing temporary price controls, taxing business at sky-high rates, and even making noises about providing health care. As Grady saw it, the trend was clear. The country was moving to socialism, fast. Grady also knew that if he and other businessmen, and they were all men in the 1950s, if he and other businessmen did not take action to reverse what was happening in the country, it would go the way of Great Britain. In Great Britain, Fabian socialists had won a majority of the British Parliament after World War II and instituted such programs as national health care. To Grady and other conservatives like him, the example of Great Britain showed that the real danger to the United States, the biggest threat to the United States, was socialism from within, not communism from without. Another thing Grady knew, turning the country around from its dependence on government programs, most of which were launched during the New Deal, would take time. Lots of time. But Grady was patient. As he told other businessmen who shared his views, they were embarking upon a 50-year project to return the country to its conservative roots. A 50-year project. Grady died in 1989. He had lived long enough to see his project begin to bear fruit. In 1950s Milwaukee, Grady and even less extreme conservatives seemed to be swimming against the tide. More than 1/3 of the city's workers belonged to unions, and nearly all were industrialized. Factories and plants were unionized. Voters in 1951 had overwhelmingly approved government intrusion in the form of emergency rent control. Milwaukee had a decades-long tradition of progressive politics. And oh yes, the city in the 1950s was headed by a mayor who identified as a socialist, Mayor Frank P. Zeidler. Undaunted, Grady and others waged a conservative counter-revolution, determined to return the city and the nation back to an era of minimal government, back to a time that honored the sanctity of the individual. Individual responsibility, individual rights, he believed, all were in direct conflict with government and with any entity that sought to harness the power of the group for the benefit of the individual. Entities like unions. Grady objected to unions because he believed in, quote, the Hebrew Christian emphasis on the sanctity of the individual. When you begin to do things collectively, Grady asserted, you have a monster. The conservative counter-revolution had its work cut out for itself nationally as well. Late in World War II, a poll found that the public believed government would help jobs and boost wages. Further, surveys showed that 43% of the American public believed government had done the most to improve living standards in the past 30 years. 42% of the public gave credits to unions, and only 15% credited management. The 1950s may have been socially constrictive. This is, after all, when the organization man was born. But the 1950s were the most economically progressive of any decade in the 20th century. A decade of unparalleled economic prosperity that had been built on the laws and policies enacted during the New Deal. Nationwide, the income gap between wealthy and middle-income workers was the smallest ever in the 20th century. Between 1941 and 1950, those in the bottom fifth of the income bracket saw their wages by 42% after taxes. For the highest 5%, income decreased by 2%. In Milwaukee, which ranked 7th in size among the 20th largest metropolitan areas, and where unions were strong, average income far exceeded the national norm. By 1957, 33% of Milwaukeeans were in the highest two income brackets, with nearly 40% solidly in the middle. The fortunes of business soared as well. In 1953, Milwaukee's Miller Brewing Company celebrated production of its 3 millionth barrel of beer, ratcheting up sales by 275%. In short, worker productivity was high, wages supported a strong middle class, and business profits were strong. Yet for mid-century conservatives, the American landscape was bleak. In their view, the mechanisms by which the nation had ratcheted to such prosperity would be the source of its undoing. And those mechanisms were the progressive policies of the New Deal. In Milwaukee, the 1951 battle around affordable housing highlights the contrasting worldviews of mid-century conservatives and progressives. That year, when Milwaukee Mayor Frank Zeidler sought to create affordable housing by using new federal funds, anti-housing activist William Peploe engaged him in battle. Peploe was not as far right as Grady, but both men shared a worldview that privileged individual rights above the collective good. While Zeidler sought to alleviate a post-war housing crisis that had left hundreds of Milwaukee families without homes, many of whom were forced to place their children in orphanages, Peploe saw government's involvement in providing low-income housing as an unfair burden to prop up those who did not pay their fair share of taxes. It is an unjust situation, he said, one that, quote, cannot be tolerated. In Zeidler's view, government was the instrument for benefiting society. For Peploe, government was an obstacle that required constant challenging. Peploe rejected, quote, a system of government which subordinates the people to an all-powerful state, unquote, and saw government as the outsider. Zeidler envisioned government not as an impersonal machine, but as a living entity made up of individuals, each of whom ideally would be dedicated to carrying out the solemn duties of helping fellow citizens. Peploe saw government as sapping individual initiative and coddling freeloaders. Zeidler viewed public service as an heroic enterprise. As he described it, quote, as we recount the services of local government, we come to realize a present basic reason for cities and their government. We build cities to build men. People's philosophy stemmed from that of early American colonists who built the new nation upon the belief that commerce has the capacity to promote rather than destroy virtue, because it encourages the development of disciplined and energetic individuals. Zeidler sought to redress the imbalance of market capitalism through his conception of the public interest, which he viewed through the role of the public servant. Public service, he stated, must lead to the ennoblement and enrichment of the cultural heritage of mankind in the struggle against ignorance, squalor, want, disease, and death. Throughout Zeidler's 12 years in office, he was challenged by conservatives on issues like affordable housing, the federal St. Lawrence Seaway project, his support for unions and African Americans, and he even faced a huge battle when he tried to launch a city-run television station. At the workplace, union members faced employers who directly challenged their notion of collective action with lockouts and mandatory lectures on free enterprise. Even as some companies began the exodus from union-dense Wisconsin to states and countries that offered cheap labor. And in the media, labor newspapers and a foreign language press that had long emphasized issues of the working class were being replaced by local and national media that attacked government, disparaged African Americans and other minority groups, and portrayed workers and their unions as corrupt, greedy, and anti-American. As journalist Thomas Stokes perceptively stated in 1948, we went through a peaceful revolution in this country in 1933, the New Deal. We are now in the Counterrevolution. Thank you very much.